What would you do if a dying man locked away in one of the coldest prisons of Clearwater asked for something no law, no protocol, no handbook in the world could ever allow? Not money, not freedom, but something human, something raw. Hours before his execution, inmate Adrian Cole whispered a final wish to the only person who still looked at him as more than a number, Nurse Lena Carvalho. And in that moment, between the buzzing fluorescent lights and the echo of keys down a hollow corridor, Lena was forced to decide. Was she going to follow the rules and let him die untouched? Or was she going to cross the line, risk everything, and give him the one thing he had been denied for 15 long years? The chance to feel like a man again, one last time. So tell me, are you ready to hear how a nurse broke every line of duty to grant the forbidden wish of a condemned man? The night shift at Red Hollow Correctional Hospital always carried a peculiar kind of silence, one that didn't soothe but pressed heavy against the skin. Fluorescent lights hummed above the white corridors, and the ticking clock on the nurse's station wall sounded louder than the footsteps of the guards. Nurse Lena Carvalho, 33 years old, had grown used to that rhythm of machines and procedures, but this Friday in October felt different, as if the air itself knew that time was running out. Less than 20 hours separated inmate Adrian Cole from the execution chamber. His name moved through the building like a whisper, not because of fear, but because of the calm dignity he carried, even as the end approached. Most saw him as another number waiting for state paperwork to close his file. Lena, however, had seen something else during the standard medical checkup earlier that week. A man who thanked her for each gesture as if it were rare, a man whose eyes carried a question deeper than any diagnosis. That night, when she stepped into his cell for the routine exam, she found Adrian seated on the narrow bed, posture straight, hands resting calmly on his knees. He looked at her not like a prisoner looking at a nurse, but like one human seeking another. His voice was soft, almost hesitant when he asked if she believed someone could change even if nobody ever witnessed it. The words pierced her professional shell, cutting deeper than any chart or file could. She answered honestly, without rehearsed medical distance. Change unseen is still change, though it is a lonely one. For the first time, Lena noticed the tremor in her own hands, the way her stethoscope felt heavier than usual. It was then that Adrian reached under the metal shelf and pulled out an envelope, thick with folded papers. He explained that inside were 15 years of his handwritten confessions, pages of remorse, and attempts to rebuild dignity in a place built to strip it away. He didn't ask for absolution. He only asked her to deliver them to Maya Hart, the widow of the man killed the night of his crime. Lena knew the walls had ears, and she knew the weight of what he was asking. Her career, her license, her carefully maintained distance could all collapse if she agreed. Yet there was something in his voice, in the way he described teaching other inmates how to read, in the absence of excuses when he spoke about his past. That unsettled her. He wasn't trying to defend himself. He was simply describing the empty years, the consequences, the hollow echo of guilt. And as she held the envelope in her hands, she realized she wasn't just holding paper, but the last fragile bridge between Adrian and the woman whose life he had shattered. She agreed, though her voice was quiet, almost unwilling to disturb the fragile air. But as she turned to leave, something changed. The guards were late on their rounds. The corridor beyond had gone still, and in that silence Adrian confessed his true fear, not death, but leaving this world without once more being touched as a man. The cell seemed smaller after his confession, as if the walls had leaned closer, eager to hear her answer. Lena felt her breath stall in her chest, the fluorescent light overhead flickering once like an uncertain witness. For years her life had been dictated by protocol, by the invisible lines she dared not cross, yet here was a man with hours left to live, asking for something that no manual, no supervisor, no rule had ever prepared her to face. He didn't beg, didn't clutch at her sleeve or demand sympathy. His words were steady, quiet, trembling only in the truth they carried. He didn't want to walk to his death as an untouched body, remembered only as a case number in a file. He wanted to be seen, to be held, to leave this world knowing he had not been erased entirely as a man. And as Lena stood frozen, she realized this was not a scandalous request, but a deeply human one, more terrifying in its simplicity than if he had asked for the impossible. Her hands, usually so certain in emergencies, now felt alien to her. She had delivered babies, restarted failing hearts, treated wounds made by blades and fists, but nothing had ever demanded this kind of decision. It wasn't medical, it wasn't clinical, it wasn't even logical. It was raw, it was forbidden, and it was pulsing with humanity. The silence stretched between them until the ticking clock on the corridor wall outside seemed to pound against her skull. Adrian lowered his eyes, perhaps expecting her to walk out, to laugh, to remind him that dignity had long ago been stripped away by his sentence. But Lena didn't laugh. She couldn't. Something in her chest had already shifted, a fracture in the careful armor of neutrality she had worn for years. And though she wanted to speak, words caught in her throat like thorns. The only thing she could manage was to sit down beside him on the narrow bed, as if her body had decided long before her mind. The chorus of judgment roared in her imagination the moment she sat. She could hear the voices of colleagues mocking her, supervisors condemning her, the faceless public ready to paint her as reckless, immoral, ruined. She saw the headlines in her mind: Nurse disgraces uniform, AIDS criminal in final hours. The thought made her stomach twist, but she did not stand. Instead, she let the silence hang, and in that silence she heard something else, softer, deeper, the ragged breath of a man who had not been allowed softness in 15 years. He looked at her, and though his eyes shimmered with gratitude, he didn't reach for her. He let her come to him slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that even the smallest movement might shatter the fragile possibility that had bloomed between them. In that moment, the cell wasn't concrete and iron anymore. It was a place where two human beings, both trapped in different ways, finally allowed themselves to exist beyond the scripts handed to them. Her mind raced through every reason to stop. This could destroy her. She could lose her job, her license, the respect of every person she had ever worked with. Yet when she thought of leaving him alone in that bed, knowing his final hours would pass without warmth, the image cut deeper than any fear of punishment. She remembered nights when she went home after a shift, stripped of energy, lying in her apartment in silence, longing for someone to reach out, to make her feel less invisible. If loneliness had been unbearable for her, free and alive, how crushing must it have been for him, caged, condemned, and waiting for the end. The thought lit a fire in her chest, one that didn't burn with lust but with fierce compassion. She turned her hand, let it brush against his, not clinically, not professionally, but simply human. His breath caught, his lips parted slightly, and his shoulders trembled under the weight of contact so small, yet so immense. The guard's footsteps echoed briefly down the corridor, heavy boots against tile, and then faded away again. Time, it seemed, was conspiring to give them this sliver of night. Lena exhaled slowly, her pulse racing in her throat, and looked at Adrian with eyes stripped of uniform and duty. He had tears caught at the corners, but his face carried no shame, no demand. Only the quiet plea of a man asking not to die as less than human. She leaned closer, unsure if she was betraying her principles or honoring them. In her ear the voice of protocol screamed, but another voice, softer, whispered louder, "Rules may preserve order, but mercy preserves souls." And in that second, she realized she wasn't choosing between her career and his wish. She was choosing between fear and courage, between silence and compassion. And once she framed it that way, her choice became unbearably clear. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, trembling but resolute. "I don't know what tomorrow will say about me," she whispered, "but tonight I will not let you be alone." Adrian closed his eyes, not as someone surrendering, but as someone finally released. The air thickened between them, heavy with unspoken things, yet alive with possibility. Her hand tightened around his, and she felt his pulse racing, fragile yet insistent, reminding her of the limited hours still left. She leaned closer, their foreheads brushing for a moment, and in that simple contact the world outside the cell disappeared. No guards, no walls, no execution schedule, just the sound of two people breathing in rhythm, the warmth of skin against skin, the recognition of dignity in its most intimate form. It was not passion, it was not scandal. It was mercy, carved into the night like a secret they both promised to protect. The kiss came unannounced, not as a decision, but as a moment that had been waiting in silence. Soft, hesitant, carrying the weight of 15 years of absence. Lena felt her chest ache with the depth of it, not because it was forbidden, but because it was so achingly human. Adrian didn't deepen it, didn't clutch or demand. He received it like rain on desert ground, letting it soak into places that had long been dust. When she pulled back, his eyes opened slowly, shimmering with tears he did not try to hide. For a long moment neither spoke, because words felt too fragile to contain what had just happened. Instead they sat there in the silence, the hum of the fluorescent light above them, the only witness to the breaking of walls far thicker than concrete. In that silence, Lena's heart pounded not with regret but with clarity. She had not betrayed her oath. She had honored the deepest truth of it, to heal where healing seemed impossible, to offer humanity where the world had stripped it away. She knew the chorus outside would never understand. They would call her reckless, foolish, maybe even corrupt. But she also knew that in this cell, in this moment, she had given a condemned man something no law could take away: dignity. And in return, she had felt something stir within herself, something long buried under years of sterile procedures and empty shifts. It was the reminder that her vocation had never been about forms or charts. It had always been about touch, about connection, about seeing the unseen. And tonight, she had finally remembered that truth. The night stretched on, hours measured not by the clock but by the sound of breathing, by the way the room seemed to soften. They spoke in whispers, not about death, not about crime, but about books, about music, about fragments of life outside these walls. Lena found herself telling him about the coastline, about the lighthouse she passed on late drives home, about the way its light swept across the waves like a hand searching in the dark. Adrian listened as if the stories were treasures, his eyes alive with images he hadn't seen in years. And when he spoke, he didn't speak of regrets or of the crime that had chained him here. He spoke of hope, fragile but persistent, and of the strange comfort that tonight had given him. His voice was steady, not because the fear had gone, but because for the first time in 15 years, he no longer felt alone inside it. As dawn hinted faintly beyond the barred window, Lena knew she couldn't stay much longer. The guards would soon resume their rounds, and the fragile cocoon of this night would collapse under the weight of routine. She pulled the blanket up over his shoulders, a gesture simple but heavy with meaning, and let her hand linger for one final moment. His eyes followed her every move, not with desperation, but with a quiet reverence. "Thank you," he whispered, the words breaking into the air like fragile glass. She smiled faintly, though her throat ached, and nodded once before standing. When she reached the door, her hand trembled on the handle, not wanting to open it, not wanting to let the outside world crash in. But she did because she had to, and the cell returned to silence, holding their secret tight between its walls. Walking down the corridor, her heart still racing, Lena felt the weight of what had just passed settle deep into her bones. She knew she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She knew judgment would come, swift and merciless, if anyone discovered what had transpired. And yet beneath the fear there was something else, a quiet certainty that she had done what was right, not for her, not for her career, but for him. Adrian would meet his end not untouched, not erased, but remembered as human, if only for one night. The thought gave her strength, even as dread curled in her stomach. Tomorrow would come with consequences. But tonight, she carried mercy in her chest, a flame no rule could extinguish. The road to Northbridge stretched beneath the early dawn like a ribbon, unraveling into uncertainty. Lena drove with both windows cracked, the October air sharp against her face, trying to keep her thoughts from sinking too deep into the night she had just lived. The envelope rested on the passenger seat, heavy as a living thing, demanding her attention with each turn of the wheel. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale as if letting go would mean abandoning the mission Adrian had entrusted her with. Coffee from a roadside diner burned her tongue, bitter and acrid, but it grounded her in the present, reminded her that she was still moving. Every mile of cracked asphalt seemed to whisper questions she wasn't ready to answer. Would Maya Hart slam the door in her face? Would the words in the envelope reopen wounds that time had only half-stitched? Or would they fall into silence, meaningless like a prayer spoken too late? As the miles rolled past, Lena's mind drifted back to Adrian's voice, low and steady in the sterile quiet of the cell. The way he had whispered her name, not in possession but in recognition, still echoed in her chest. She remembered the way his shoulders had trembled under her touch, how a single kiss had seemed to fill the air with a peace heavier than passion. She hadn't given him absolution, nor had he asked for it. What she had offered was presence, the gift of being seen and held, even when the rest of the world had reduced him to chains and paperwork. That memory lingered now as both balm and burden, strengthening her resolve even as it deepened her fear. She had crossed a line that could cost her career, but somehow that consequence seemed small compared to the thought of breaking her promise. If she failed to deliver the envelope, the night they had shared would unravel into betrayal. The first signs of Northbridge appeared just as the sun clawed its way over the horizon, pale light stretching across rooftops and tired streets. It was the kind of town that wore grief without display, a place where sorrow blended into routine instead of spectacle. Houses with peeling paint-lined streets shaded by old sycomoros, their leaves rusting into gold as autumn deepened. She parked across from a modest home with a bicycle leaning against the porch railing, its chain rusted with neglect. For several long minutes, she stayed in the car, her pulse quickening with every passing second. Through a window, she saw the flicker of a light in the kitchen. Her fingers tightened around the envelope until the edges bit into her skin. This was the moment she could still turn back, erase her tracks, retreat into the safe confines of silence. But then she pictured Adrian's face in the dim light of the cell, the way relief had softened his eyes when she agreed. Turning back was no longer an option. The front door opened and Maya Hart stepped onto the porch. She was a woman in her late 30s, her hair pulled back in a simple knot, an apron still tied around her waist, as though she had been pulled directly from her morning rituals. The weight of old grief clung to her posture, but not in a dramatic way. It was quieter, etched into the way her shoulders curved inward, the way her eyes carried exhaustion without complaint. Lena felt her throat tighten as she stepped out of the car, the envelope held firmly against her chest. "Mrs. Hart?" she called softly, her voice trembling under the weight of the moment. Maya looked up, cautious but not unkind, her gaze measuring the stranger who had spoken her name. When Lena approached, she held out her badge, her identity laid bare. "My name is Lena Carvalho. I work at Red Hollow Correctional Hospital." She didn't disguise it, didn't soften it. The truth had to arrive as it was. Maya's eyes flickered, a mixture of recognition and dread passing like shadows across her face. She didn't step back, but she didn't step forward either. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Why are you here?" Lena's pulse thundered in her ears as she offered the envelope with both hands, as though presenting something sacred. "Adrian Cole asked me to bring this to you. He wrote these pages over 15 years. He wanted you to have them. Not through a letter, not through the mail. He wanted someone to look you in the eyes and tell you that his last thoughts were not about himself, but about you and your husband." The silence that followed pressed heavy on Lena's chest, But Maya did not retreat. She looked at the envelope as though it might burn her, then slowly reached out and took it, her hands trembling only slightly. Without a word, she opened the door wider. "Come inside," she said. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish, the kind of home where life had continued because it had to, not because it wanted to. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a Polaroid photograph. Maya and her husband on a carousel, laughing as the wind tossed their hair. The image caught Lena off guard, as though she had stepped into one of Adrian's unfinished prayers. Maya gestured for her to sit, then lowered herself into a chair by the window, the envelope resting in her lap. She opened it carefully, almost reverently, pulling out the thick stack of papers. Her eyes scanned the first page, lips moving faintly as she read, the words catching in her throat but never breaking. Every few lines she paused, returning to a sentence as though weighing it against the years of silence she had carried. Lena sat motionless, her hands clenched in her lap, watching as grief and recognition wrestled across Maya's face. Minutes passed, the only sound the faint rustle of pages and the distant bark of a dog outside. Maya's tears came slowly, not in dramatic bursts but in quiet streams that left her expression calm, almost serene. Then, midway through the stack, a small brass key slipped from between the pages, landing softly in her lap. She picked it up, confusion flickering in her eyes before returning to the letter. Adrian's words explained. A library locker inside the prison, filled with books donated in her husband's name. Dictionaries, novels, blank journals, all meant for the support group she had founded for families of victims. "It doesn't erase the past," his handwriting declared, "but maybe it opens small doors in the present." Maya's lips parted slightly, a whisper escaping that Lena could not hear. She held the key tightly, tears falling silently onto the pages in her lap. When she finally lifted her gaze, Maya's eyes locked with Lena's. "He thought of this?" she asked, voice raw, not with disbelief, but with something softer. Lena nodded. "Every day," she said gently. "He wanted you to know that your husband's name was not forgotten, that it became his prayer." Maya's hand pressed against her mouth, as though steadying herself against the weight of the words. She did not collapse, did not rage. Instead, she breathed slowly, deeply, as if exhaling years of silence all at once. Lena remained still, afraid any movement might disturb the fragile balance of the moment. In her chest, her heart hammered with both fear and relief. She had delivered the message, but she didn't know if it would heal or wound. And yet, in Maya's steady gaze, she saw something she hadn't expected, an openness cautious but real. "I don't know what to do with this," Maya said finally, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel right now." Her fingers smoothed the edges of the papers, her thumb resting against the ink-stained margin of one page. Lena leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet, respectful. "You don't have to decide today. You don't even have to decide tomorrow. But he wanted you to have this, to know that in his last hours, your pain weighed more on him than his own fear." Maya blinked hard, the tears clinging stubbornly to her lashes. She looked down again at the Polaroid on the mantel, her husband's laughter frozen in a moment, untouched by tragedy. For a long while she said nothing more, but the room itself seemed lighter, as though some small corner of it had been opened to air after years of being shut. Outside, the morning deepened into day. Children rode bicycles down the street, their laughter breaking the stillness like bells. A neighbor's dog barked again, impatient for attention. The ordinary world carried on, indifferent to the extraordinary exchange happening inside that quiet living room. Lena sat with her hands folded, watching Maya cradle the stack of papers against her chest, as though protecting something fragile. She wondered if Adrian would ever know how his words had landed, if he would sense it somehow in those final moments. The thought made her throat ache. She wanted to tell him, to carry back more than just silence, but for now, all she could do was sit in the presence of the woman whose forgiveness or lack of it would shape everything that followed. When Lena finally rose to leave, Maya followed her to the door. Her expression was softer now, less guarded, though the grief was still there, etched into her features. "Thank you," Maya said quietly, "for bringing this to me yourself. I don't know if I can forgive him, but I know he wanted me to have this. And that matters." Lena nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She stepped out onto the porch, the autumn air crisp against her face, and felt the weight of the envelope replaced by a new burden, the need to return to Adrian with an answer, however incomplete. The streets of Northbridge seemed brighter now, though the weight of sorrow lingered like a shadow. As she walked back to her car, Lena knew her night's promise was only half fulfilled. The hardest part still lay ahead. The door had almost closed behind Lena when Maya's voice called her back, soft but insistent. She turned, surprised, to see the widow standing in the hallway, the envelope pressed tightly against her chest. Her eyes carried a different weight now, not just grief but something more intimate, a wound reopened by memory. "There's something you need to know," Maya said, her voice low, trembling as though it had been kept in silence for far too long. She gestured toward the living room again, and Lena stepped back inside, the air thick with unspoken things. They sat once more, and Maya's hands, still clutching the papers, trembled slightly as she searched for the right words. "The night before my husband died, we fought," she whispered, "over something stupid, something that should have disappeared by morning. But it didn't, and then he never came back." Her lips quivered, but her eyes stayed locked on Lena's, demanding witness to the confession. The admission struck Lena with unexpected force. She had seen grief manifest in many ways, anger, silence, bitterness, but what Maya carried was a different kind of torment. It was guilt woven into every breath, the knowledge that her last words to the man she loved had not been words of love at all. "I told him I was tired of his long hours," Maya continued, her voice catching, "that maybe I would have been happier if I had married someone else." She swallowed hard, pressing the envelope against her as if for protection. "It was cruel and I didn't mean it, but those were the last words he ever heard from me. That's the weight I've carried for 15 years. Her tears fell freely now, staining the papers in her lap, though she didn't seem to notice. Lena's chest tightened as she listened, feeling the echo of the widow's pain reverberate against her own. Maya lifted one of Adrian's pages and pointed to a passage she had underlined with shaking fingers. "Here," she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Lena leaned forward, scanning the handwriting, her pulse quickening. The words leapt from the page. "I know the night he died was not perfect. Every couple has their fights, their moments of anger. But I pray she remembers his laugh on the carousel, the way the wind carried it, louder than any cruel word could ever be." Maya's breath hitched as she looked at Lena, astonishment and sorrow mingling in her expression. He wrote this, without even knowing what happened. How could he have known? How could he put into words the very thing that has haunted me for years? Her voice cracked, trembling between awe and anguish. For a moment the room felt suspended, as though the ordinary world outside had ceased to exist. Lena felt her own eyes sting, the coincidence, or perhaps something greater, too heavy to dismiss. Adrian had spoken directly into the widow's deepest wound, not with knowledge, but with the intuition of a man who had spent years studying pain, his own and others. Maya pressed the papers against her heart and let out a long, shuddering breath. "Do you see?" she whispered. "He gave me back the memory of my husband's laughter. He gave me permission to replace those last cruel words with something else. I don't know what that means. I don't know if I can forgive him for what he did. But I do know," her voice trailed, breaking under the weight of revelation. "I do know that he changed something in me today." Lena reached across the table, her fingers brushing lightly against Maya's trembling hand. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "healing doesn't come in the way we expect. Sometimes it comes sideways, through words we never thought we'd hear." Maya nodded slowly, but her face carried a new resolve. She looked at Lena with an intensity that made her heart stutter. "You said he has hours left, didn't you? That tomorrow it will be over." Lena hesitated, then nodded. The truth was cruel, but there was no use softening it. Maya's grip on the envelope tightened, her eyes glistening as she whispered the words Lena least expected. "Then I want you to go back to him. I want you to tell him that I forgive him." The air in the room shifted at those words, as though something larger than either woman had leaned closer to listen. Lena's breath caught, her throat tightening with disbelief. Forgiveness was something most people withheld forever. Yet here it was, offered freely in the final hours. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice trembling, afraid to mishear. Maya nodded, tears streaming down her face, her voice steady now despite the weight of it. "Tell him that I forgive him. Tell him that I choose to remember my husband's laughter. Not the fight, not the ending. Tell him that he doesn't have to carry this guilt into the dark." She reached across the table, pressing the envelope into Lena's hands again, as though sealing her request into a mission. "Promise me you'll tell him." The promise sat heavy in Lena's chest, heavier than the envelope itself. To deliver such words would not only change Adrian's final hours, but also change the way he faced death itself. It was a gift more powerful than any reprieve the state could grant. Lena closed her hands around Maya's and whispered, "I promise." The words left her lips like an oath, binding her to a path she could not abandon. For a moment, the two women sat in silence, bound by a grief that belonged to both but wore different faces. Then Maya released her hand, wiping her tears with her apron, her expression weary but strangely lightened. "Then go," she said softly. "Go before the morning takes him away from you." When Lena stepped outside again, the air felt sharper, as if the town itself had shifted under the weight of what had just passed. She walked back to her car, the envelope once again beside her, but now carrying a message far greater than words on paper. Forgiveness. It pulsed in her mind, in her chest, as though alive. The drive back to Red Hollow loomed ahead, each mile heavy with the urgency of time slipping through her fingers. She started the engine, the car rumbling to life, and stared down the long road leading back to Clearwater. Adrian's face flashed in her mind, the quiet strength in his eyes, the trembling vulnerability of his confession. And now, the thought of being able to deliver to him the one thing he had never dared hope for filled her with a determination that overpowered her fear. The highway blurred under her tires as Lena sped toward the prison, her heart pounding with each passing exit. Reporters would be gathering by now, preparing their questions and cameras, hungry for spectacle. The execution team would be assembling, checking procedures, ensuring everything ran like a machine. But somewhere inside those walls Adrian was waiting, unaware that a message of forgiveness was racing toward him. The thought gave Lena chills, the urgency of her mission fighting against the ticking of the clock. She pressed harder on the accelerator, her knuckles pale against the wheel, whispering under her breath as if the words could push the car faster. "Hold on, Adrian. Hold on just a little longer." By the time the prison's grey walls rose into view, the sky had turned the color of steel, heavy clouds dragging shadows across the razor wire. The parking lot was already crowded with vans and reporters, their cameras pointed like weapons at the gate. Lena pulled in, her badge pressed firmly against her chest as if it were armor, and stepped out into the cold wind. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, though none knew who she was or why she had come. Inside she would have to pass through scrutiny, through suspicion, through the layers of bureaucracy that guarded every door. But she carried something stronger than fear. She carried Maya's words, and no barrier could stop her from delivering them. The corridors inside Red Hollow buzzed with a different energy now, taut and impatient, every sound sharper than before. Guards stood straighter, nurses whispered in corners, and the air carried the electric weight of finality. Lena walked quickly, her heart hammering, her badge flashing at every checkpoint. The closer she came to the infirmary, the heavier the envelope felt, as if the papers inside knew their final task was near. When she reached the small room where Adrian waited, she paused, pressing her palm flat against the cool surface of the door. For a brief second, fear threatened to overtake her, fear of discovery, of judgment, of punishment, but then she remembered Maya's trembling voice, her plea for this message to be delivered. Aunt Lena pushed the door open, stepping into the room where a condemned man waited for the last words he would ever truly hear. The room where Adrian waited was quiet in a way that made every small sound matter. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, hands clasped together, his shoulders squared as if he were preparing for a trial all over again. Lena stood for a moment just inside the door watching him, the envelope trembling in her hands. He lifted his head when he sensed her presence, and his eyes, those calm, steady eyes, lit with a faint surprise. "I came back," he said softly, as though he hadn't truly believed she would. Lena closed the door behind her, her pulse hammering in her throat, and stepped closer. She wanted to ease into the moment, but time pressed against her ribs like a fist. She could hear the shuffle of guards outside, the buzz of voices preparing for procedure. Every second mattered now. She drew a breath, steadied herself, and said the words that carried the weight of 2 lives. "Maya read your letters." The silence after her statement was thick, almost unbearable. Adrian blinked, his breath faltering, and for a long moment he simply stared at her as though the meaning of the words refused to land. His lips parted, then closed again, his throat working to form questions he couldn't quite voice. Lena stepped closer, holding out the envelope, the pages now touched by Maya's tears. "She read every word," Lena continued, her voice low but unwavering. "She knows about the library, about the books you set aside for her group. She knows you prayed her husband's name every day." Adrian's hands trembled as he reached out, not to take the papers, but to steady himself on the mattress, his body shaken by something heavier than fear. "And?" he whispered, his voice breaking like glass. "Did it hurt her? Did I just—" His words caught, swallowed by the weight of dread. Lena crouched in front of him so their eyes were level, so he could see the truth in her gaze. "No," she said firmly, cutting off his spiral. "It didn't reopen wounds. It gave her something she thought she had lost forever." She hesitated, her own throat tightening, and then spoke the words that had burned in her chest since she left Northbridge. "She forgives you, Adrian." The room seemed to tilt with the force of the revelation. His eyes widened, disbelief flashing across them, followed by a trembling hope that looked too fragile to survive. "No," he breathed, shaking his head, his hands rising to cover his face. "No, that can't be. She wouldn't. After everything I took—" His voice broke entirely, and the sound of it cracked something in Lena, too. She reached for his wrists, gently lowering his hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "She forgives you," she repeated, steady and clear. The transformation was immediate, a shudder that ran through his body like a wave breaking against stone. Tears streamed freely down his face, tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. His shoulders collapsed forward, not in defeat but in release, the crushing weight of guilt slipping from him at last. He covered his mouth, sobbing quietly, his body rocking with the force of it, and Lena stayed there with him, steady, unflinching, her hand resting on his arm. She felt the tremor of decades unraveling under her touch. For 15 years he had carried the certainty that no apology, no act of penance, could ever pierce the wall of pain he had built in another's life. And yet in his final hours, forgiveness had reached him, not through legal pardon or divine decree, but through the trembling voice of a widow who chose memory over bitterness. It was more than he had ever dared to hope. When Adrian finally lifted his face, his eyes were red and raw, but there was something new in them, something luminous. "She forgives me," he whispered, as though testing the taste of the words. "She forgives me." His lips curled into the faintest, trembling smile, a smile not of joy but of recognition. He shook his head in wonder, his hands pressed against his knees, grounding himself. "I thought I'd die unseen," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I thought the best I could do was leave behind a pile of words, knowing she'd never read them. And now, he trailed off, searching for breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Now I can walk into that room tomorrow knowing I was forgiven. That matters more than life itself. Lena swallowed hard, her own eyes wet, realizing she had just delivered not only a message, but salvation. The knock at the door startled them both. A guard's voice called through, curt and businesslike. 15 minutes. The reminder was a blade cutting through the fragile bubble they had built. Adrian drew a shaking breath, straightening his back, his composure returning with surprising strength. 15 minutes, he echoed quietly, almost reverently. He turned his gaze back to Lena, his expression solemn but no longer broken. Stay with me until then? She nodded without hesitation, pulling a chair close to his bed, her hand never leaving his. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed less harsh now, the walls less suffocating. For the first time, Adrian sat not as a prisoner waiting to die, but as a man who had been given permission to leave this world lighter than he had lived in it. Lena could feel it in the air, the shift in gravity, the soft silence of judgment retreating. As the minutes trickled away, the chorus of the outside world seemed to fade, replaced by a hush that honored the moment. Even the guards outside the door seemed quieter, their footsteps softer, their voices restrained. The usual edge of cruelty, the muttered comments about monsters and justice had disappeared. It was as if forgiveness had seeped through the cracks in the walls, silencing the choir that had long condemned him. Adrian leaned back against the wall, his hand still clutching Lena's, and exhaled with a peace that startled her. For the first time in 15 years, he said softly, I feel like a man, not a number. The words struck her deeply, echoing his original confession, and she squeezed his hand tighter, committing every second to memory. She wanted him to carry not just Maya's forgiveness, but her presence too, into whatever came next. The chaplain entered briefly, offering a short prayer, his voice respectful, stripped of any moral lecture. Adrian listened, but his eyes never left Lena's. When the chaplain left, Adrian let out a small laugh, surprising both of them. You know, he murmured, I always thought death would be cold, but tonight it feels almost warm. Lena's heart clenched, her throat aching with unshed tears. That warmth is yours, she whispered back. You earned it. His smile lingered faintly, and for a moment she saw not the inmate, not the condemned man, but the teacher he had once been, the man who had spent years guiding others to words, to knowledge, to pieces of freedom even in chains. It was that man who would now walk into his final hour, carrying forgiveness like a torch in the dark. When the guard returned and signaled it was time, Adrian rose to his feet slowly, deliberately. He didn't rush, didn't falter. He stood tall, his head high, as though he were about to step onto a stage rather than into the chamber. Lena rose with him, her hand lingering against his arm until the guard cleared his throat. Their eyes locked one final time, and in his gaze she saw not fear but gratitude. Tell her, he said softly, that her forgiveness carried me further than chains ever could. Tell her she saved me. Lena nodded, her voice gone, but her eyes told him she would. The guard opened the door and the moment fractured into movement, into the cold mechanics of procedure. But something had shifted, something even the state could not touch. Adrian Cole was no longer walking to his death as a broken man. He was walking as someone forgiven. The corridor leading to the chamber echoed with footsteps, but this time they didn't sound like dread. They sounded like resolve. Lena followed a few paces behind, her badge granting her access, though her heart felt bare. She watched as guards who once looked at Adrian with disdain now avoided his eyes, their voices subdued, their hands almost gentle in their duty. The shift was undeniable. Forgiveness had entered the room before the execution ever could. And as Adrian paused briefly to turn back toward her, his lips formed a silent, "Thank you," the words burning into her memory like fire on glass. She nodded once, fighting the urge to reach for him again. This was his walk, his final step, and she would not take it from him. But she would remember it always. When the door to the chamber closed, Lena felt her knees weaken, her body heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. She sank into a chair outside, pressing the envelope against her chest as though it might keep her heart from breaking. Inside, the machinery of justice would proceed, indifferent and precise. But outside, in the silence of the corridor, a nurse knew she had delivered more than medicine, more than words. She had delivered absolution, and even as tears slipped down her face, she felt no regret. Only the certainty that compassion, even when forbidden, had the power to change the final chapter of a man's story. Adrian would not die erased. He would die forgiven. The official announcement came with the sterile precision of a machine. Time of death, confirmed by 2 doctors, initials scribbled on forms that would outlive the man they measured. The corridors of Red Hollow echoed with the sound of radios crackling and pens scratching, as though bureaucracy wanted to claim the last word. Lena sat in a metal chair outside the chamber, her palms pressed hard against her knees, her breath shallow. She had stayed until the very last moment, until the guards escorted Adrian through the final door, and it shut with a dull, echoing thud. Now the silence pressed in around her, thick and merciless. The world would call it justice, final and clean. But inside her chest, Lena knew it was never that simple. She had seen the way his face changed when she told him Maya forgave him. She had watched the weight lift from his shoulders, had seen him rise taller not as a prisoner, but as a man walking free within himself. That truth was larger than any certificate of death. Outside the gates, the media frenzy boiled. Reporters crowded against the fences, their microphones thrust forward like spears, their questions loud, sharp, designed for headlines. Monster meets his end. Justice for the victim. Closure at last. Lena heard the noise even from within, the chant of a society desperate for neat endings. Yet she also saw the subtle cracks forming. A guard who had once called Adrian an animal now stood quietly in the corner, his jaw tight, his eyes lowered, unwilling to mock. A nurse who had rolled her eyes at his courtesy now dabbed her face with a tissue, as if dust had irritated her eyes. The chorus of cruelty was not silent, but it faltered, and that faltering mattered. It meant that something in Adrian's last hours had unsettled the script, rewriting the narrative in ways no one would admit aloud. Lena carried that knowledge like a hidden ember in her chest. Her shift ended with none of the usual relief. She walked through the staff exit, the cold, clear water wind rushing into her lungs like punishment and release at once. Her badge, clipped at her chest, felt heavier than iron. She imagined turning it in, imagined the disciplinary board summoning her, imagined whispers spreading through the hospital corridors. But she also remembered Adrian's final look, the gratitude that had burned like fire in his eyes. If consequences came, she decided, they would not erase what had been done. Some acts live outside the reach of rules. She climbed into her car, the empty passenger seat beside her a cruel reminder of the envelope that was no longer there. It rested now in Maya's hands, soaked with tears, transformed from confession into bridge. Lena gripped the steering wheel, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She hardly recognized the woman looking back at her, not because she was guilty, but because she had finally remembered what courage felt like. The days that followed blurred into an uneasy rhythm. At the hospital, whispers spread like infection. Some colleagues avoided her eyes, convinced she had crossed a line. Others watched her with something different in their gaze, curiosity, maybe respect, though they would never say it aloud. No one confronted her directly, not yet. The system moved slowly, and Lena suspected the questions would come eventually, in an office with locked doors and cold voices demanding explanations. But for now she carried on, her posture steady, her heart anchored in what she had done. Each time she walked past the infirmary, she thought of the cell, the narrow bed, the blanket folded with care. She thought of Adrian's voice, trembling but steady, whispering, "She forgives me." The memory wrapped around her like a shield. She knew she would need it, because the world does not easily forgive those who choose mercy over rules. Meanwhile, news of Adrian's final act began to ripple outward in ways small but undeniable. Someone from the prison library mentioned the locker filled with books, the dedication written in Maya's name. Word traveled to Northbridge, to the support group she had founded years ago. Soon whispers turned into conversations, about remorse, about the possibility of change, about the strange, unlikely connection between a widow and the man who had destroyed her life. Maya herself remained quiet, refusing interviews, refusing spectacle, but her silence carried power. Those who had expected rage, condemnation, a tidy headline about vengeance were left instead with a void. Into that void, curiosity and doubt crept, unsettling the rigid narratives that made people feel safe. And Lena knew, though she never said it aloud, that this was the true aftermath of forgiveness. It unsettled, it destabilized, it made people question. At night, Lena often found herself unable to sleep. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of the prison. The clang of doors, the buzz of lights, the shuffle of guards' boots. Yet beneath those echoes lived something softer, something that had been absent from her life for years. The memory of Adrian's trembling hand in hers, the way he had breathed as if alive again, filled the silence of her apartment. It wasn't romance she remembered, nor was it scandal. It was the fierce intimacy of recognizing someone in their rawest humanity. She had given him what he asked for, not spectacle, not passion, but touch, warmth, presence. And in return, he had given her back a piece of herself she thought she had lost forever. The ability to feel deeply, to risk, to choose compassion, even when it cost her everything. That memory refused to fade. It became a quiet companion in her solitude. The chorus of society, however, did not grow quiet easily. The papers printed predictable headlines. Talk shows debated whether remorse meant anything at all. Callers phoned into radio stations, some demanding stricter punishment, others daring to suggest that people could change. The voices collided in the airwaves, harsh and unrelenting, but Lena stopped listening after the first few days. She knew that public opinion was a storm that devoured itself. What mattered was not the noise outside, but the silence inside. The silence of a man who had died forgiven, the silence of a widow who had chosen to remember laughter over cruelty, the silence of a nurse who had found her vocation again in a prison cell. Those silences were louder than any broadcast. They lived in the marrow, in the quiet moments when no one else was watching. And Lena clung to them, knowing they were more enduring than headlines. One evening, after a particularly long shift, she climbed to the hospital's rooftop, the wind sharp with salt from Clearwater's coast. The sea lay dark in the distance, waves breaking silently against the rocks, unseen but powerful. She stood there for a long time, the chill biting her skin, her hands tucked into her coat. In her pocket, she carried a copy of the brass key Adrian had left behind, registered under Maya's name. She held it in her palm, its weight small but immense, and felt the quiet warmth it radiated. It wasn't just a key to a locker of books. It was a symbol, proof that even within walls meant to punish, doors could still be opened. She lifted her gaze to the night sky, where the lighthouse in the distance cast its beam across the waves. For a moment, she imagined it sweeping across Adrian's path, guiding him wherever souls go when they are finally set free. The weeks passed, and with them, the edges of the storm began to soften. Northbridge announced that the donated books would be used to open a new shelf in their community library, a quiet dedication to the memory of Maya's husband. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a plaque with his name and the book stacked neatly, waiting to be borrowed. Children pressed their noses against the glass, adults carried novels home, and some even left notes tucked between pages, thank yous, confessions, fragments of lives touched by the chance to read. Lena heard of it through a nurse who had family in Northbridge. She didn't go right away, didn't want to turn it into pilgrimage, but the knowledge of it lived in her heart. another ember in the growing fire of quiet change. She imagined Maya there, watching as the shelf filled with life, carrying her grief in new ways. It was a vision that steadied Lena's steps, and yet beneath the calm, Lena remained vigilant. She knew consequences might still come, an inquiry, a suspension. Whispers turned into formal accusations. Each day she entered the hospital, she braced herself for the moment when someone might pull her aside, ask questions she couldn't answer without unraveling everything. But day after day it never came. Perhaps the system had chosen silence. Perhaps those who suspected had decided some truths were better left unspoken, or perhaps forgiveness had extended further than she realized, softening even the edges of bureaucracy. Whatever the reason, Lena continued her work, steadier now. Her voice firmer when she said yes to true emergencies and no to empty demands. Her choices had sharpened her, stripped away hesitation. And though she carried the secret of that night like a scar beneath her uniform, it was not shame she carried. It was memory, and memory gave her strength. In the end, the greatest consequence was not punishment but transformation. The woman who had once ended her shifts hollow, drowning in paperwork and silence, now walked with a new weight in her steps. Not a burden but an anchor. She had seen mercy triumph in a place built for cruelty. She had watched forgiveness shift the course of a man's final hours, and she had allowed herself to break a rule so that something greater could survive. Lena knew the world would never understand. They would never know the truth of what passed in that cell, of how a kiss born not of romance but of compassion had restored dignity to a condemned man. But she knew. Adrian knew. Months passed, and the memory of Adrian Cole's final hours continued to ripple outward in ways Lena hadn't expected. Northbridge's small community library dedicated an unassuming corner to Maya's late husband, the shelf lined with the books Adrian had arranged in secret. It wasn't a grand gesture plastered across headlines, but it didn't need to be. Children's fingers traced the spines of dictionaries, mothers borrowed novels, fathers checked out blank journals to gift their children. Between the pages, notes began to appear, written by anonymous hands. "Thank you for this door. I learned a new word today. Grief feels lighter here." Each message was a quiet echo of something Adrian had planted, long before the world thought he was capable of change. Lena learned of these notes through whispered reports, and though she never claimed them as her own story, her chest filled with an unspoken pride. The seed had taken root. One afternoon, Lena drove to Northbridge herself, her heart pulling her toward the town she had entered weeks earlier with dread. She parked across from the library, her badge tucked away, her presence anonymous. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink, the hum of voices low and reverent. She found the shelf easily, her fingers brushing over the plaque with Maya's husband's name engraved in plain, unpolished letters. She didn't cry, though her throat ached. Instead, she stood back and watched as a little boy climbed a stool to reach a book on the top row. His mother steadied him, smiling faintly, unaware of the history woven into the wood and words. For Lena, it was enough. She didn't need recognition, didn't need to tell her side. All that mattered was that Adrian's attempt at redemption had survived, not in his name but in the life it continued to nurture. That, she thought, was the true inheritance. When she left the library, the autumn air carried the sound of distant laughter. She turned a corner and found herself standing before a park where children spun on swings and climbed over jungle gyms. At the far edge of the park stood a carousel, its bright paint dulled by time, currently still, its panels propped open for maintenance. The horses were half dismantled, their wooden legs braced, their colors faded but not erased. Lena froze, her breath catching. The Polaroid from Maya's mantle flashed in her mind, Maya and her husband on a carousel, frozen in laughter that had survived tragedy. The broken ride before her seemed almost symbolic, a reminder that even joy requires repair, that laughter sometimes waits beneath scaffolds. She stood there for a long time, watching the sunlight glint off the carousel's mirrors, and realized the metaphor had completed itself. Broken things aren't abandoned, they're mended. Sometimes the pause is not an ending, but care in progress. Driving back to Clearwater, Lena let the vision of the carousel settle in her chest. It became a symbol she carried like the brass key, proof that moments can be dismantled and rebuilt, that laughter can survive even in fragments. She thought of Maya again. The way her voice had trembled when she admitted to fighting with her husband before his death, the way Adrian's words had unknowingly soothed a wound no one else could touch. That circle of pain and release had now widened, passing into a community, into strangers who didn't know the names but felt the impact. Mercy, Lena realized, multiplies. It doesn't stop at the person who receives it. It spills, it echoes, it creates spaces where silence once lived. And though she still felt the sting of risk, the fear of discovery, she knew she had become part of something far greater than her own story. At the hospital, she worked differently now. She said yes to true emergencies with a sharper focus, no longer drained by paperwork's false urgency. She said no to meaningless requests with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Patients noticed. Some whispered gratitude. Others simply relaxed when she entered the room, sensing something different in her presence. She carried the memory of Adrian like a hidden compass, not sharing it, not boasting, but allowing it to guide her choices. And the chorus of her colleagues, those who once mocked, those who whispered, began to shift too. Their comments softened. Their eyes met hers with a mixture of respect and something else, something uncertain, perhaps even humility. Mercy, she thought again, was contagious, though it spread slowly like dawn. Maya and Lena's paths crossed once more weeks later, when Lena visited Northbridge again under the quiet pretense of errands. Maya greeted her at the door, her face still carrying the weight of loss but now gentler, less sharp. They shared coffee in her kitchen, words flowing more easily this time. Maya spoke of her support group, how the books Adrian had arranged were already being borrowed, how members had begun writing in the margins, leaving notes for each other like secret encouragements. "It's strange," Maya admitted, her voice soft, "to know that something born out of tragedy is helping others heal. I don't know how to feel about that. But I do know I don't feel as alone anymore." Lena reached across the table, touched her hand and smiled. "That's the point," she said. For once Maya's answering smile held warmth. Forgiveness had not erased grief, but it had reshaped it. The chorus of judgment from society grew quieter as time passed, though never entirely silent. There were still voices that demanded only punishment, that scoffed at the idea of redemption. But Lena noticed something remarkable. Those voices no longer dominated. When she overheard conversations in the cafeteria, when she passed by reporters camped outside Red Hollow, their words carried less certainty. Doubt had entered the narrative, and doubt, Lena knew, was the beginning of change. If even one person began to wonder whether mercy could exist alongside justice, if even one person softened in their condemnation, then Adrian's story had not been wasted. It had shifted the script even slightly, and that was enough to begin rewriting the larger story. One night, alone in her apartment, Lena took out a blank sheet of paper from an old shoebox, where she kept forgotten notes and thank-you cards. She didn't write the story of what had happened. That would remain locked forever between her, Adrian, and Maya. Instead, she wrote a single line across the top. Compassion sometimes requires breaking rules to keep faith with what is human. She folded the paper neatly, placed it in the box, and closed it. It wasn't a confession. It was a reminder, something for her future self to find, when the weight of bureaucracy threatened to smother her again. She realized she didn't need to record details. The memory lived too vividly inside her to ever be forgotten. The paper was simply a seed, a promise that she would never let herself forget what mattered most. The more she carried that promise, the more she began to notice the quiet ways in which change revealed itself. A fellow nurse who once sneered at Adrian's courtesy now lingered a little longer with difficult patients. speaking softer, listening more. A guard known for cruelty surprised her by offering a blanket to an inmate without being asked. Small gestures, almost invisible, but Lena saw them, felt them, recognized their origin. Compassion spreads like a whisper, not a shout. It doesn't announce itself. It slips into corners, softens edges, alters tone. And once it begins, it's almost impossible to contain. She thought of Adrian again, how his request had seemed impossible, how his letters had felt like a last cry into silence. Yet here they were, echoing far beyond him into lives he would never touch directly. That was his legacy. Not the crime, not the punishment, but the quiet shift he had sparked. When Lena returned to Red Hollow for her next night shift, the clock on the infirmary wall ticked the same as always, indifferent, merciless. But she no longer hated it. Time, she realized, could not be controlled, but it could be altered by what filled it. The memory of her night with Adrian proved that even hours carved by cruelty could hold warmth. She walked past the cell that had once held him, empty now, its bed stripped, its walls bare. For a moment she paused, her palm pressing lightly against the door. She didn't whisper anything, didn't pray. She simply stood, letting the silence between them stretch once more, this time not heavy but alive. She carried him with her into the next patient's room, into the next conversation, into the next choice. And that was how he lived on, in the unseen ripples of mercy. The carousel image returned to her dreams often, spinning in fragments, its horses frozen mid-motion, its mirrors reflecting laughter from years ago. Sometimes she woke with tears on her face, unsure if they belonged to her or to the lives she had touched, but she always woke with a strange comfort too, the knowledge that broken things aren't useless, that silence isn't final, that mercy isn't weak. She began to believe that perhaps life was less about fixing everything perfectly and more about daring to offer warmth where the world had gone cold. That was what Adrian had asked for, what Maya had given, what Lena had carried forward. And as she drifted back into sleep, she often imagined the carousel repaired, spinning again, laughter rising into the air, not untouched by pain, but brighter because of it. Red Hollow never changed on the surface. The wall stayed grey, the wire stayed sharp, and the clock over the nurse's station ticked with the same merciless rhythm. Yet for Lena, nothing was the same. Each time she entered the infirmary, she carried an invisible weight, one not of guilt but of memory. She remembered the trembling warmth of Adrian's hand, the way his voice cracked when he whispered, "She forgives me." That moment lived inside her like a flame, guiding her steps through the sterile corridors. When patients came to her now, she didn't see files or diagnoses first. She saw stories, broken places waiting for gentleness. It wasn't always easy. Many rejected her efforts, many spat their bitterness, but she no longer feared rejection. She knew the cost of silence, and she refused to let it win. Mercy had given her new strength, and she wore it not as a shield but as a second skin. The whispers about her lingered, as whispers always do. Some nurses still gossiped, convinced she had crossed lines that should never have been touched. Some guards watched her with suspicion, muttering that compassion had no place in a prison. But there were others too, quiet voices that rose in her defense when no one else was listening. "She treats them like humans," one colleague said in passing. And maybe that's the point. It wasn't a confession of agreement, but it was enough. The chorus of cruelty had dulled, and in its silence other notes began to emerge, softer, tentative, but real. Lena understood then that change never arrives in thunder. It comes in whispers, in the way a single candle challenges darkness without ever claiming to defeat it. And she had become that candle. Not because she wanted to, but because Adrian's last wish had lit her. Maya remained in touch, though sparingly. Letters arrived every so often, brief but heartfelt, sharing the slow evolution of her grief. She wrote about the library shelf, about the children who borrowed books and the notes left behind by strangers. She confessed that forgiveness hadn't erased her pain, but it had reshaped it, turned it from a chain into a stone she could carry without collapsing. "I don't forgive the crime," she wrote once, "but I forgave the man who lived with its weight." That's the difference. Lena read those words in her small apartment, tears warming her cheeks, and realized that Maya's journey mirrored her own. Both had chosen mercy, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And both had discovered that mercy doesn't absolve, it transforms. The difference mattered, and it gave their choices power. The brass key remained pinned to Lena's bulletin board, its dull shine catching the light whenever she returned home. She often touched it absent-mindedly, running her fingers over its grooves as though reminding herself that doors still opened in the world. It wasn't just a key to a locker in a library anymore. It had become a reminder that even within walls meant for punishment, something small could grow, something no one could predict. Each time she looked at it, she thought of Adrian's quiet voice, his calm dignity, the way he rose to meet his final hour not as a number, but as a man who had finally been forgiven. She thought of Maya, too, holding her husband's memory without bitterness for the first time in years. The key was not an object. It was a promise. And Lena guarded it fiercely, as if it were the last living fragment of that night. Seasons turned, and the city outside the prison continued its rhythm. Autumn gave way to winter, winter to spring. Life returned in small bursts, flowers in the cracks of sidewalks, laughter rising from children playing in schoolyards. Lena noticed them more than she ever had before. She had always been too tired, too consumed by the weight of her shifts to pay attention. Now she found herself pausing to watch, to listen, to breathe. It wasn't that her life had become easier. It hadn't. It was that she had learned where to look for meaning, and it was always in the smallest places. A hand held longer than necessary, a laugh that refused to be swallowed, a moment of mercy where none was expected. These things, she realized, are what outlive us. Not headlines, not punishments, but the fragments of humanity we dare to pass on. One evening she returned to Northbridge, not with a mission, not with an envelope, but simply because she felt pulled there. She walked again to the park where the carousel stood. This time it was alive, its music playing faintly, children riding painted horses as the machine spun in golden light. Parents watched from benches, their faces soft, their voices mingling in laughter. Lena stood at the edge of the park, her chest tightening at the sight. The carousel, once broken and still, now turned again, its mirrors catching the sunlight, its music rising into the air. She thought of the Polaroid on Maya's mantel, of laughter frozen in time, and realized the image had finally come full circle. Life had not erased the pain, but it had allowed joy to return, spinning round and round, carrying both grief and hope in its motion. In that moment, Lena felt Adrian's presence again, not as a ghost, but as a memory woven into the air. She could almost hear his voice, steady and soft, repeating the words he had spoken in his final hours. "I thought I'd die unseen." But he hadn't. He had been seen, held, forgiven. He had left something behind that no execution could erase. Lena smiled faintly, her hand brushing against the brass key in her pocket. It was enough. She didn't need monuments or recognition. The carousel turning, the books lending, the laughter rising, that was his legacy. And it was hers too, in a way. She had been the bridge, the fragile link that carried mercy across impossible ground. And though bridges sometimes creak and sway, they hold. She had held. And that was all that mattered. Walking back to her car, Lena felt lighter than she had in years. The sky above was streaked with the colors of dusk, pink and orange melting into indigo. She paused once more, looking over her shoulder at the spinning carousel, its music faint but steady. In her chest, the rhythm of the ride merged with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She thought of the line she had written on that blank sheet of paper tucked away in her shoebox. Compassion sometimes requires breaking rules to keep faith with what is human. It no longer felt like a reminder. It felt like a truth she had carved into her life, one she would carry forward no matter where her path led. Mercy wasn't weakness. Mercy was courage, and she knew now that courage was the only thing that could truly outlast time. Back at Red Hollow, her shifts continued. The clock still ticked indifferent, marking hours with the same cold precision. But Lena no longer dreaded its sound. To her, each tick was a reminder not of what was lost, but of what had been given. Time could never be defeated, but it could be redeemed, and she had seen it happen. In a cell, in a widow's kitchen, in a library shelf filled with words. She had learned that even in the coldest of places, warmth could bloom. And that warmth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be real. She walked the corridors with her head high now, not in defiance, but in quiet faith. She had been changed, and she would not let the world strip that change away. Her final memory of Adrian was not of his execution, not of the chamber, not of the sterile announcement of time, of death. It was of him standing tall, his eyes filled with gratitude, whispering thank you with a voice steady, despite the trembling. It was of the kiss they had shared, not scandalous but sacred, born of compassion, proof that he had been touched not as a prisoner, but as a man. That was what she carried, not the ending, but the moment before the end, the moment when mercy had silenced judgment. And when she thought of him now, she didn't see bars or chains. She saw the carousel spinning, the laughter rising, the books waiting on their shelf. She saw the proof that broken things can be mended. And she smiled. The moral of it all lived not in sermons, not in rules, but in the story itself. A condemned man learned that forgiveness could reach him even at the edge of death. A widow discovered that grief could soften when memory replaced bitterness. And a nurse remembered that her vocation was never about charts, but about humanity. Their lives, intersecting in one forbidden night, had built something larger than any of them. And though the world would never know the full truth, those who carried it, Lena, Maya, even Adrian in his final breath, knew that mercy had triumphed where judgment had expected to reign. In the end, the story wasn't about absolution or scandal. It was about courage, compassion, and the quiet truth that even in places built for endings, beginnings can still be born.